Chrissie Carnell Bixler had been living in a quiet kind of torment. On the surface, she was vibrant. An actress, a former model, someone who had once walked with pride in her steps and hope in her eyes. But behind the scenes, inside the quiet, moments when no one else was watching, there was a storm constantly raging. A storm seeded by someone she had trusted, someone she had loved. His name was Danny Masterson. They had met during the golden days of Hollywood's late 90s and early 2000s glamour, a time when charisma outshined conscience and celebrity often trumped morality. Danny, the rising star from that 70s show, had seemed like the perfect boyfriend. He was charming, respected, and deeply entrenched in the world of Scientology, a world that soon began to swallow Chrissie whole. The relationship was never soft. It wasn't gentle. It was power cloaked in affection, control masked as love. Chrissie often questioned her own mind. Was she being dramatic? Was she misremembering? Was the pain in her chest just a lack of understanding or something more sinister? The answer came to her slowly, in flashes of memory she could no longer suppress, moments that clawed their way into her dreams and woke her with tears she couldn't explain. She remembered the night she said no. She remembered waking up confused, disoriented, violated. But how could she say it out loud? In the world they lived in, silence was safer. Danny was protected, not just by fame, but by a machine built to shield its own. Scientology had a way of keeping secrets buried deep beneath layers of loyalty, fear, and institutionalized gaslighting. When Chrissie spoke about the things she had felt, the things she suspected had happened, she was told she had misunderstood. She was told she had consented, but her body knew otherwise. Her spirit did too. For years, she kept quiet. Not because she wanted to, but because she felt she had no choice. The consequences of speaking up weren't just professional, they were spiritual, social, and deeply personal. She was made to feel as though her pain was an inconvenience to others, as though her trauma was a betrayal of something sacred. It wasn't until 2017 that the dam inside her finally broke. The world was shifting. The movement was building a storm of its own. And Chrissie, like so many others, found the courage to speak. But it wasn't easy. Coming forward meant more than just telling her story. It meant risking everything. Her peace, her privacy, her safety. As one of 4 women who publicly accused Danny Masterson of rape and sexual assault, Chrissie knew what she was walking into. The backlash was immediate and vicious. She was called a liar, a traitor, an opportunist. Her career was scrutinized. Her motivations were questioned. Her faith, both spiritual and emotional, was attacked. But she refused to back down. Because, for Chrissie, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about fame. It was about healing. It was about truth. It was about justice, not just for herself, but for every woman who had ever been silenced, ignored, or gaslit into submission. She remembered the exact moment she sat down and gave her statement to the LAPD. Her hands shook. Her voice trembled. But her soul stood tall. She told them everything. Every horrifying detail, every night she wished she could forget, every wound that had festered in the dark. And when she walked out of that room, she didn't feel broken anymore. She felt brave. After the statement was filed, Chrissie expected the hard part to be over, but it wasn't. In truth, the hardest part had just begun. Because the justice system doesn't move with the urgency of pain. It moves with cold precision, dragging out the moments that matter most, testing the limits of the human spirit. Chrissie had already lost so much. Her sense of safety, her faith in love, her belief that justice was blind. But now, as she stepped deeper into the legal process, she realized she was going to lose even more, because this fight wasn't just against Danny Masterson. It was against an entire culture of denial, silence, and protection. Almost immediately, she began to feel the invisible forces pulling against her. Private investigators followed her car. Her phone would act strange, glitching, disconnecting mid-call. Friends became distant. Calls went unanswered. She felt the long, suffocating reach of Scientology pressing against her reality, reminding her that this wasn't just about one man. This was about a system that had protected him. Chrissie was labeled the enemy. Still, she held firm. There were moments when she questioned everything. She would stare into the mirror, looking for cracks in her strength, afraid she was losing the very identity she had fought to reclaim. The anxiety clung to her bones. There were nights she couldn't sleep, nights she cried into her pillow, wondering if speaking up had been a mistake. But even in those moments, even in the quiet corners of her doubt, she knew the truth. And that truth was sacred. The DA's office took her case seriously. She wasn't alone. There were other women, other voices, and each story, though unique, echoed the same horrifying patterns: coercion, silence, violation, and control. Together, they formed a chorus of resistance that could no longer be ignored. Danny Masterson, once the charismatic star with a toothy smile and devil-may-care attitude, was now facing the full weight of accountability. But he didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He denied everything. To him, they were liars, opportunists. He wrapped himself in a cloak of arrogance and innocence, deflecting every accusation with smug dismissal. He smiled at court appearances. He walked with his head high, and behind him stood a small army of supporters, some blind, some complicit, some too afraid to ask the right questions. For Chrissie, this display of shamelessness felt like a second assault. She had relived her trauma over and over, through police reports, interrogations, therapist sessions, and now the courts. And still, Danny Masterson walked like a man untouched. Untouched by guilt, untouched by fear, untouched by remorse. The media picked up the story, and with it came a storm of commentary. Some praised her bravery, others tore her apart. Every photo became a battleground. Every interview was dissected. People debated her trauma like it was a trending topic. Some days, she avoided the internet altogether. Other days, she read every word, letting the cruelty harden her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman watching from the shadows, afraid to speak, afraid to remember, afraid to believe that they, too, could be heard. The court proceedings were slow and clinical. Chrissie sat through the hearings, flanked by attorneys, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She listened to legal jargon, to statements that made her stomach turn, to a defense that twisted her pain into fiction. And yet she didn't break, not in front of them. She couldn't afford to, because they were watching, all of them, and even though her voice trembled, it never vanished. When she took the stand, she wasn't just Chrissie the actress. She wasn't just a girlfriend from the past. She became a mirror, reflecting every woman who had ever been violated, silenced, and then forced to prove her pain in a room full of strangers. She told them the truth. The horrifying, uncomfortable, inconvenient truth. And whether they believed her or not, she refused to be erased. Chrissie sat alone in her apartment one evening, the city buzzing outside her window, but inside her heart there was only stillness, the kind that comes when you've screamed all you can and no one truly hears you. The courtroom had become a battlefield, not just of legal arguments and testimonies, but of memories, violent, suppressed, and sharp as glass, rising to the surface without mercy. She remembered everything in excruciating detail. The nights she couldn't move, the way Danny would smile as if nothing had happened, the way she had to pretend it hadn't, just to survive. When she told her story on the stand, her voice didn't shake like she expected it to. It cracked only once, and in that moment, the weight of years collapsed on her chest like 1,000 bricks. She could feel every eye in the room on her, Some sympathetic, others cold and skeptical, and yet she stood in her pain like armor. The defense tried to dismantle her story piece by piece, asking cruel questions, implying she had stayed because she wanted to, suggesting that her memories were fiction, but Chrissie didn't flinch. Not this time. Because what they didn't understand was that survival doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes it looks like silence, sometimes like denial, but eventually it looks like fire. After the hearing, she walked past Danny, whose face remained disturbingly calm, as though he believed none of it could touch him, as though the truth couldn't reach that deep. But Chrissie knew something he didn't, that even if the system failed her, even if the world looked away, she had reclaimed her story, and there was nothing more powerful than that. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions she didn't answer, cameras flashed, strangers whispered her name with either reverence or scorn, but Chrissie didn't stop to explain. She had done enough. She had shown the world what courage looks like when it bleeds, what truth sounds like when it cracks open, and what justice means when it has a woman's face. There were days when Chrissie wondered if justice was worth the price it demanded, because the emotional toll was relentless, unyielding, and often invisible to those around her. Behind every brave interview and courtroom appearance, there were sleepless nights, panic attacks that came without warning, and moments of deep despair when she questioned whether the world would ever truly believe her. Her friendships had changed. Some had faded, others had fractured, and she noticed how even well-meaning people avoided her now, unsure of what to say, how to support, or whether her story made them too uncomfortable to bear. In private, she still battled the lingering trauma, the flashbacks that gripped her in the quiet hours of the morning, and the cold sweat that accompanied memories she couldn't erase, no matter how much therapy she embraced or how bravely she tried to rebuild her life. The public didn't see that part. They saw a headline, a face, a name tied to a scandal. But they didn't see the woman picking herself off the floor after a breakdown, or the way her heart raced every time she entered a crowded room, uncertain of who might recognize her, judge her, or worse, dismiss her. She tried to return to some kind of normalcy, to find joy in small things like coffee in the morning or a walk without fear. But the world had shifted, and the innocence she once carried was now a distant echo. Yet through all of it, she refused to become bitter. Instead, she poured her energy into advocacy, quietly connecting with other survivors, lending them the strength she had fought so hard to reclaim. And in doing so, she found a new purpose, not just to survive, but to lead. Danny Masterson continued to fight the charges with expensive lawyers and a powerful network behind him. But Chrissie had something stronger now: truth, resilience, and the rising tide of women who were done being silent. Even when the legal system dragged its feet, even when verdicts were delayed and justice seemed uncertain, Chrissie held on to the belief that her voice had moved the needle, that her suffering had not been in vain, and that one day the world would not only hear her, but remember her for the fire she refused to let go out. When Chrissie Carnell Bixler first walked into the police station to report what Danny Masterson had done to her, she wasn't just carrying memories. She was carrying ghosts, ones that had clung to her skin and whispered lies into her ears for years, convincing her that maybe what she remembered wasn't real, that maybe she had exaggerated the nights, the pain, the paralysis, the terror. But deep down, she knew the truth, and it screamed louder with every step she took toward justice. The moment her name went public, it was as if the world had split in half, one part applauding her bravery, the other preparing to destroy her. Tabloids printed distorted versions of her story, online trolls flooded her inbox with hatred, and whispers began circulating in the industry that Chrissie had become difficult, controversial, unhireable. Still, she pressed on, because the silence had already stolen too much from her: her sleep, her sanity, her sense of safety, and she refused to let it steal her future. Scientology, the powerful institution that had once wrapped itself around her life like a second skin, now became an enemy, unleashing a quiet, methodical war meant to intimidate her into silence. Private investigators trailed her car. Former friends turned cold. Even inside her home, she felt like a prisoner, checking the locks twice, sleeping, with a light on, jumping at every unexpected noise. The system was slow, and every delay felt like another betrayal, another message that the pain of women could wait, could be debated, could be dissected endlessly before anyone would even consider believing them. When she finally sat in the courtroom, facing the man who had violated her and then walked around for years as if nothing had happened, she wasn't afraid. She was furious. Because he had taken something from her, something sacred, and the world had let him. She watched as his lawyers twisted timelines, questioned her character, suggested that maybe she was confused, maybe she had misunderstood, and with every suggestion, Chrissie felt the weight of every survivor in the room with her, because this wasn't just about Danny. It was about every woman who had ever been told her story was too messy, too emotional, too late. And yet she stood there, her voice shaking but never breaking, and she told them everything, detail by excruciating detail, not because she wanted pity or fame or revenge, but because she needed the truth to exist outside of her own body, so it could no longer be denied, erased, or buried under the weight of someone else's silence. When the verdict finally came, Chrissie was sitting in a narrow hallway outside the courtroom, her hands cold, her heart pounding in a rhythm that felt too fast to be human, because for years she had lived with a question that haunted her more than any nightmare. What if no one ever believed her? What if the system failed her like it had failed so many others? The courtroom was quiet when the words were read aloud, guilty on 2 counts of forcible rape, and for a brief, shattering moment, the air left her lungs like a wave of grief and justice all tangled into one. She didn't cry at first. She didn't move. She just sat there, absorbing what it meant to finally be heard, to finally have her truth validated by something bigger than herself. And yet even in that moment of victory, there was no celebration, because nothing could undo what had been done. Nothing could return the years she had lost, the nights she had spent unraveling in silence, the pieces of herself she had to gather, with trembling hands. Outside, the media storm erupted again. Headlines screamed that a celebrity had fallen, but to Chrissie this wasn't about fame. It was about freedom, not just for her, but for every woman who had watched her fight and felt a flicker of hope. She knew there were still people who would doubt her, who would call her a liar, who would accuse her of destroying a man's life, but she had stopped caring about those voices the moment she found her own. In the weeks that followed, she avoided the spotlight, choosing instead to find healing in solitude, in therapy, in the arms of loved ones who had stayed through the darkest parts of her storm. Sometimes she would walk through the park near her home, listening to the wind, the birds, the subtle music of a world still spinning, and she would remind herself that she had survived, that she had fought, and that her pain had not drowned her. It had transformed her. Chrissie was no longer the girl who doubted her memories, who questioned her worth, who bowed her head in shame. She was a woman who had walked through hell and carved a path for others to follow. And though the scars remained, though justice had come years too late, she had proven something unshakable, that even when the world tries to bury your truth, it will rise again, louder, stronger, unbreakable.